In the last lesson, we were talking about repeaters, and we ended by talking about how we need a special tone to access the repeater, a sub-audible tone. Today, we're going to look at what happens once we do have access to the repeater. So, once we've gained access to the repeater by setting the correct repeater offset and the correct tone, what do we say? How do we find someone to talk to on the repeater? Well, usually on ham radio, when we want to find someone to talk to, we call CQ. But things are done a little differently on repeaters. So, generally, it's not necessary to call CQ on a repeater because calling CQ takes a very long time. You have to say CQ, 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 this is KD2 EOM or something like that. It takes a long time. And the reason it takes a long time is so that someone scrolling through the frequencies will be able to find you because you'll be talking on, and as they're scrolling by, they won't be able to miss you. But when we're looking at repeaters, people generally don't scroll through repeaters like that. They're usually just sitting on the repeater frequency, waiting. So you don't need to do something extra long. It's not necessary to call CQ. It's simply saying your call sign is sufficient to let everyone know you're listening and monitoring the repeater. Maybe you could say, this is KD2 EOM listening for a contact, or something along those lines. But you just need to say your call sign, and maybe a little bit more if you want to introduce yourself. All right, how about identifying yourself on a repeater? So if you'll remember back from an earlier section, hams are required to identify themselves every 10 minutes and I believe at the end of your transmission. So how do we do that? Well, there are a few ways you can do that. There's a few ways you can identify yourself on repeaters. One way, which is a little bit strange, honestly, is you can send the call sign using CW or Morse code. You can, and we're going to talk more about Morse code later, but you can send it out in Morse code in a series of beeps which spell out your call sign. That's acceptable. Although for the average person, that usually doesn't work, and that leads us to the second way of identifying yourself, which you probably already guessed. You can just use your voice and say, this is KD2 EOM. Just use your voice and talk into the microphone because repeaters generally use voice. There's no need to tack any kind of indicator on at the end saying you're talking on a repeater. For identification, just speak your call sign into the mic like you normally would, or identify using CW. Even if you're transmitting on a voice mode, you can still identify in Morse code. All right, so there's just a few more things to cover. In fact, there's a few more random things. Normally, this would be the addendum, but I've just decided to smush the addendum into this end of this video right here. So, I'm not sure if I mentioned this before or not. I believe I did. Oftentimes, your signal can reflect off of buildings and such. If you're transmitting on ham radio, your signal can reflect off various stuff and bounce all over the place, which is pretty cool. And there's a cool result of this. If you're in a city and buildings are blocking your signal's path to the repeater, you can try bouncing it off another building to find a path that reflects signals to the repeater. So you can reflect your signal off of buildings, which is pretty cool. So say for some reason, maybe with this pickup truck diagram, there's something in the way. Maybe there's a giant mountain in the way. I don't know. A giant mountain blocking the signal. Maybe the pickup trucks can, instead of pointing directly at the mountain where it just hits the mountain and the mountain absorbs the radio waves, they can point it off to the side somewhere and it reflects off a building. And somehow it goes around this mountain and gets to the repeater, or gets to the other station, which is a very neat way of accessing a repeater in situations like that. So you can see the diagram here, which is pretty cool. All right, now calling stations on a repeater. We've talked about calling CQ. Calling stations on a repeater is the same way you answer a CQ call. Say the station's call sign, the other guy's call sign, then your call sign. So if I'm KD2 EOM and I want to call KD2 AMB, I might say, KD2 AMB, this is KD2 EOM. So KD2 AMB is the other person's call sign. This is KD2 EOM, which is my call sign. KD2 or KD2 FOM we can use for the sake of this video. All right. Right. Okay. Another thing to note that the test wants you to know, don't use a repeater if you don't need it. Remember, there is such a thing as simplex communications, and what that means is just talking with another station just on one frequency without repeater, just transmitting directly to that station. and you're having a direct-to-direct contact, which is probably what you would think of normally. So don't use repeaters if you don't need them. If you can use simplex, if you can make the contact work without a repeater, do so, because otherwise you're needlessly tying up the repeater. You're taking it away from someone who does need it. So only use a repeater if you absolutely, well, not if you absolutely, but only if it would really help. If it doesn't matter, then you should prioritize simplex operations. All right, just a couple more things here. There's a term called reverse split, which is the test wants you to know about, the reverse split function of your radio. So what this means is split refers to, by the way, split operation is when your transmit frequency is separate from your receive frequency. So instead of them being the same, they're split, so that one's a transmit and one's receive. I don't remember if I've already mentioned that in this course, but I'll just mention it again now, in case I didn't. And anyway, it's a good reminder for you. So the transmit frequency is different from the receive frequency. And as I told you last lesson, this is how repeaters work. They use split operation. Okay, so the reverse split function on your transceiver switches around the frequency. So if you set one frequency as the transmit frequency and one as the receive, they'll switch around. So the transmit frequency will become the receive frequency. The receive frequency will become the transmit frequency. It switches them around. And you may be asking, why would you possibly want to do that? And the reason is because sometimes this way you can better hear the other guy on the repeater's input frequency. So, for instance, say that the two pickup trucks are talking to each other, but the other pickup truck is actually closer to you than the repeater is. And you can't quite hear the repeater signal coming back to you, but you can hear the other guy's pickup trucks. If you listen on the repeater's input frequency, which is the frequency you're transmitting on to connect to the repeater, you can hear the other pickup truck. So say pickup truck A, for example. Pickup truck A is trying to talk to pickup truck B. And I know pickup truck B is over there, but just pretend he's over here somewhere. Actually, why don't we make a pickup truck? Maybe we can make a pickup truck C. There we go. So that's pickup truck C, okay? So they're both transmitting on the repeater's receive frequency, right? It actually would make more sense for pickup truck A to listen on the frequency where pickup truck C is transmitting to the repeater, instead of listening to the repeaters to pickup truck C's signal on the repeater coming back, because pickup truck C is closer to pickup truck A. So the bottom line is, if you're confused at this point, just know the reverse split function switches around the frequencies, and it can be useful for better receiving the other guy's signal if the other guy's closer to you than the repeater is. That's all you need to know. Sometimes it can help you receive the other guy better. All right, and finally, there's just one last thing in this video, and then we can move on to the next section. Some repeaters are linked together in a network. What this means is that there's a network of a bunch of repeaters. So there's a bunch of repeaters, usually in a certain area. Maybe they're all around the county or something. Any signal that's received by one of the repeaters in the network is also repeated by all the repeaters in the network. And this is called a linked repeater network. Some repeaters are linked together in a network. So for example, let's say that there's a repeater network in a certain county, and there are 3 towns in this county. There's Warwick, there's Chester, and there's Washingtonville, and there's a repeater in each of those 3 towns, and they're all linked in a linked repeater network. So if I transmit a signal to the Warwick repeater, it will also be repeated on the Chester and Washingtonville repeaters. And then someone in Washingtonville can transmit a signal back to me through the Washingtonville repeater, and it'll transmit all the other repeaters, including the Warwick repeater and the Chester repeater. And this way, through this big network, it really extends the range of my station because there's multiple different repeaters. And you can see now we have 3 repeaters on the board. So if I transmit to one repeater, it gets transmitted to all the other repeaters, which really helps extend the range. Okay, so that's the last thing for this section. The only thing I want to leave you with before you go on is you can study now the Gordon West Manual for this section, study all the questions in the repeater section, but I also want you to study questions T2B12 and T2A04. I'm going to write those on the screen. T2B12 and T2A04. And these questions are in the going solo section, which is the previous section. I moved them into this section because they're repeater questions, and for some reason they were in the other section, and I thought they worked better in this section. So study the repeater section questions, study T2B12 and T2A04 from going solo, then you can attempt the quiz. And with that, I wish you luck, and I will see you in the next video.